Hello and welcome to an episode of How to Paint. I recently got an amazing deal on this Crashed X-Wing expansion, and although I've played a ton of Legion, I realized I don't really have that much terrain myself. So today we're going to explore some weathering techniques. Without further ado, let's get painting. The kit itself is fairly straightforward, and it also comes with a bonus scenario as well, which is really awesome. So you can use this as terrain, or you can use it as a mission. I'm starting off by assembling the model, and I'm using plastic glue for this. There isn't much room for customization, but the pieces jigsaw together quite nicely. And as you can see, this is probably going to be the biggest thing on the channel I've painted so far. It is definitely going to be different to just painting normal miniatures. I'm going to prime the pieces in black first, and here's a pro tip to help you save some time. Use a spray can for this. I figured I'd use the airbrush because I'm going to be using it a little bit here, but it took forever, and I think a spray can would be a lot faster. And I'm applying some white from above, as you can see, and again I probably would have done this with a spray can. And now to start adding some color, we're going to be using some brown leather. And I am running this through the airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, you could apply this with a normal paintbrush, but this seemed to save me some time here. And then once the areas of dirt are done, I'm switching over to deck tan, and I'm using this for the X-Wing pieces. I'm not too worried about accuracy, and I don't mind some overspill between the X-Wing wing here and the dirt that it's buried in. I wasn't paying too much attention, and you can kind of see my airbrush is backfiring a little bit here because I kind of made it angry. But I was able to get a nice clean coverage. I'm going to be doing an all-over wash, and for this I'm using an enamel wash. This is Dark Wash by Meg Productions. And so this is just running the dark wash through the airbrush. And again, you can use a brush if you don't have an airbrush. And you can kind of see it's very runny, it's very messy, and just letting it just hit the model as quick as possible. And then I'm switching over to the thinner, and I'm using this to pull away that wash. So it's almost like a normal acrylic wash, but in reverse. What I like about the enamel washes over the acrylic washes for these kind of pieces, they work really well on the bigger scale stuff, but also it dries really gritty and grimy. It's got that very Star Wars look to it. And one more thing to note, if you are new to the channel here and you haven't used these before, whenever you use enamel washes, to clean your brushes you do need to use odorless thinner and not water. Next I'm using some painter's tape, and I'm masking off some of the areas of the markings on the wings that I want to use. I'm using the box as reference here, but I'm just guessing roughly where I think these markings would lie. And then here I'm using AK's dark blue, and I'm painting in those markings. You could use any color you like. You can use red for Red Squadron, whatever, yellow, green, but I chose to mimic the box art here. And then once that's dry, I'm pulling off the masking tape. And you can kind of see there's just a little bit where it kind of screwed up, but for the most part it gives you a nice clean straight line. And I'm going back to that original deck tan, and I'm just tidying up some of those areas. For some of the other markings on the X-Wing, there's already panel lines that I can kind of follow, so I'm just using those instead of masking the whole thing. And this is where artistic expression comes in, so if you wanted to do any kind of different markings, you can. And as you can see, some of these areas I didn't quite line up the markings right, so I'm just extending them with that original blue color. And now I'm switching over to sky blue, and I'm just applying a couple highlights here, nothing too special. I could sit here and highlight every single panel, but I'm just adding a couple of details. It helps breaks up some of that solid blue color. And then I'm just dry brushing on some of that original deck tan. The wash does bring the overall color down just a notch, so by dry brushing this back on it, it brings up that brightness again. And now I'm using some Grim Black speed paint, and I've thinned this down just a little bit with some of the speed paint medium, and I'm applying this to some of the more gungy areas of the X-Wing. Any kind of exposed technical panel or anything gets this Grim Black wash. The laser cannons were running pretty hot on this X-Wing before it crashed, so I'm giving that same wash on here. And then I'm just adding a few more details here with that same color, and it helps break up all that tan. I'm applying that same wash onto the windows. And because it's a 50% paint and 50% medium mix that I've made, it does run quite nicely into those recesses. And then a few more paint strokes helps create a nice smooth gradient. There's a few loose panels that I missed in the sculpt, so I'm going back and painting them back up with the deck tan. And then a quick once over with that same enamel wash. For a few more details, I'm switching over to neutral grey, and I'm picking out a few more panels, and again, this is entirely up to your own design. I am making sure that if I make any design decisions on one wing, that I'm mirroring it on the others as well. And lastly, I'm applying that same grey on the canopy of the X-Wing. For a nice complementary colour, I'm using Yriel yellow, and I've done the same masking tape technique and just adding a couple stripes here. This can be pretty thin, so it does need a couple coats. I'm going to start adding some weathering here, and to begin with I'm using that same neutral grey, and I'm just adding a few strokes with the brush just to create some scratches. And then to help it fit in with the rest of the model, I'm using that same enamel wash, but this time I'm selectively choosing where I apply it. I'm using a sponge and with some deck tan, just dabbing on some smaller scratches onto some of the panels. It's a quick way of getting some really intricate scratches and things without having to be too clumsy with a normal brush. And I find that if you dab it onto a paper towel first, it helps get some of that excess off and you have a little bit more control. And here I'm using some coal black, and I'm doing the same technique as I did before. Your mileage may vary on this. It really depends on how beat up you want the X-Wing to be. I went for some light damage, but the nice thing with weathering is you can build up to the state that you want it to be in. And lastly, for some contrast, I'm using some bold titanium white, and I'm doing the same thing here. I'm dry brushing some black onto the engines to give a really nice sooty appearance. And then with some deck tan on some of these bluer panels, I'm starting to add some scratches. It helps to add variation to the damage that you're applying. This is where I find the most fun, is when you're just working your way around the model and you just get to play a little bit with some of these effects. So here's some black, and I'm just extending some of these sponge marks. I would also recommend stepping back every few minutes just to make sure that you're still on track and you haven't overdone it. I wasn't quite happy with the window on the X-Wing, so I'm using some Runic Grey just to help add a blue tint to the overall look of the windshield. And this is still mixed in with some Speedpaint medium just to help flow into a nice natural gradient. I'm starting to wrap up on the X-Wing itself, so I'm just going around and checking to see if there's any kind of pipes and things in the sculpts that I've missed. And then I hit those with a plain black. For the ground itself, again, this may vary depending on the biome that you want to put the X-Wing in. I kind of wanted mine to match the game mat that I already have. So I'm dry brushing on some orange leather. I was really tempted to match it to the box art, but I figured this would be a nice neutral fit. And to add some variation to all this brown, I'm using some Orc Skin contrast paint and just dabbing that on in various patches. I'm kind of using this like a strong wash just to kind of add a little bit of color. I didn't realize that my camera had died by this point, so I apologize, but I did the rocks in a neutral grey, and then I gave them an all-over wash with the Runic Grey contrast paint. And here I'm just adding some additional highlights to the canopy with a light grey that I mix with the grey and the white. I'm helping to integrate the base into the X-Wing itself a little bit more, and this is some of that original brown leather paint, and I'm sponging it on just to help accentuate some mud splatter. And to jazz up these rocks a little bit, I'm just dry brushing on a fairly light grey. And to add some interest, I'm using Malignant Green. And this is a very thin contrast paint, and it actually works more as a wash. So I'm applying it, and then I will damp the brush and just feather those edges. And then some hardened leather, just to help sell the fact that these rocks have been buried in this mud for a while. And once you're happy with the weathering that you've got, it's time to move on to the characters. So for this poor R2 droid that was ejected pretty quickly from its X-Wing, I'm highlighting it back up to a fairly light grey. I'm not going too heavy on the paint because it's already got some nice defined details from all the existing weathering that we've applied. And then I'm using pure white and just very quickly highlighting some of these details. For the droid itself, you can really use any color again. For mine, I'm using Evil Sunz Scarlet, and I'm just selectively picking a few panels that I feel I want to highlight in that red. And then I'm using that existing yellow that I've used on the X-Wing and picking out just a couple more panels on the sides here. It really is up to you how you want to design the droid, and so I'm just choosing things at random. And then the same as the X-Wing, this is some of that brown leather, and I'm just dabbing on some mud splat. Lastly, I'm using the orange leather and just picking out some of those cables. Moving on to the pilot, I'm using some Vallejo's earth texture, and this is basically just acrylic paint and gravel mixed together. So I'm just applying this in some areas. I don't really need to cover the whole base with this. And then I've got some stones that I'm just throwing into the base as well. I'm looking to match the same texture as the X-Wing bases. For the pilot herself, I'm going to be doing something very quick and easy. So this is Fire Giant Orange as a contrast paint. I did actually just paint up a Hoth Luke, which you can see right here. And because that was a hero model, I spent a little bit more time on that one. It was also done without contrast paints or washes as well. So this is a much quicker and easier way of going about it. But if you wanted something a little bit more in depth, feel free to check out that tutorial. For the leather parts of the costume, I'm using that same grim black from before. And so I'm applying this to the gloves and the boots. And I'm also using this for the pistol as well. For the box panel, I'm using a neutral grey for the initial colour. And I'm trying to be as accurate as I can here, but if I make mistakes, I'll just go back in and tidy it up. And then this is just white on the straps. This might take a few coats because that orange is quite strong underneath. For the helmet, I'm using a base coat of Deck Tan. And then I'm using some Nuln oil, and I've watered this down so it's about 50% wash and 50% water, and I'm applying this to the vest. I just want some of those ridges to stick out a little bit more, and if there's any details on the panel or anything, it will catch that as well. Here I'm using Seraphim Sepia, and just putting this on the helmet, it just helps out pick out some of the details in the helmet. And for her face, I'm starting off with Bugman's Glow, Not too worried about the details just yet, so this is just an all-over coverage first. And while that's drying, I switch back to the coal black, and I'm just picking out a few more of those details on the costume. Here I'm using a light grey, off-white colour, and I'm just very loosely gesturing towards eyes here, and then a black for the pupils. It can be a little Google-eyed, so if you take the original flesh tone, you can kind of thin that out and get more of an expression. Here's some pink flesh, and I'm starting to highlight some of those areas of the face. And then for my brightest highlight, I'll mix some of that deck tan with the pink flesh and just highlight the tip of the nose and maybe the cheeks. I've mixed some of that Evil Sunz Scarlet in with the pink flesh for the lips. For her hair, I'm using Iyanden yellow. And this is a contrast paint, so it does work the same way as those speed paints. I'm adding some markings on the helmet. And again, this is entirely down to your own interpretation. I opted for something a little bit more simple. And here I'm just carefully applying a stripe right down the middle. For a few final highlights on the helmet, I'm using that original deck tan. For the last few details on the helmet, I'm using some Yriel yellow. And then I'm mixing in some white into that yellow and using this as a highlight for the hair. I'm adding some very quick lines on the front of the helmet for some hazard stripes as well. And there's a couple of lenses poking out, so I'm just hitting these with some of that yellow again. I'm hitting a few details on the panel on the chest, and I'm just letting my brush just catch the sculpt on these. And just adding a couple colors just to add some interest. And a couple of highlights on the top of the panel. For the gun, I'm just doing some very quick highlights. This is 2 or 3 different greys, and I'm just letting that brush catch some of the more raised areas in the sculpt. And I'm doing the same for the boots. I'm making sure I'm doing a quick once over, and there's a couple of greeblies on the outfit that just need a little bit of attention. And then matching that base to the existing bases I did for the terrain, this is the brown leather. And then once that was applied, I kind of felt like the jumpsuit was a little flat. So I mixed together some red and yellow and started to build up into a nice bright orange. And then finally adding some white into that orange just to help add a few edge highlights here. And then lastly on the base, just copying that same recipe that I already have. And it helps match this to the terrain. And for the rim of the base, matte black. And there we have it, a X-Wing pilot and her crashed X-Wing. This was a really fun kit. I wasn't expecting this to be like as fun as it was, but once you get into that flow of weathering, it really does become very hypnotic. I think what was most surprising was how quick this whole thing took. I think I did the pilot in maybe 3 hours, and the X-Wing was, excluding drying times, maybe 4 hours. And for something this size, it's like, wow, that's kind of crazy. As I said at the beginning of the video, I don't often have a lot of terrain ready to go, so this is going to make those games more interesting and exciting. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, and if you have any future suggestions for terrain, feel free to like the video. It really does help me out, and also subscribe if you haven't. I release painting videos every week, and surprisingly, I've managed to stick to that schedule so far. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.